it really is amazing what primary teachers do.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Stuart Welsh.
Hello, Kieran.
Lisa Coe.
Hi, Kieran.
And Neil Almond.
Good evening, everyone.
So this is going to be slightly different from normal because this is almost a recreation of the panel that we sort of, took part in during MassConf 29 in Kettering. Although the panel was different on the day from planned, and it's different now from the panel that took part, but I think we're still going to have a really rich conversation. And so my first question on the day, and my first question now is going towards you, Stuart. What does mastery mean to you? And is it something we should aspire to?
So thank you for passing that question to me first, Kieran. What a question it is indeed. I think that's something that we could talk on and on at length about. And I do feel that definitions of mastery vary wildly, depending on who you speak to. And so I think it's certainly important for us to consider what mastery probably isn't, as well as maybe how it's evolved over time to what we currently think of mastery at the moment. And so I suppose the first thing I would say that mastery probably isn't is that it's not a textbook or an online platform, and it's not a curriculum either. There's plenty of things available that may say, here's a mastery curriculum, or here's a mastery textbook or whatever, but these things are just resources. I think it's how you use these things that determines whether you're adopting a mastery type approach. And so, yes, a solid, logically sequenced, coherent curriculum is a foundation there. But for me, it's about what we do as teachers, the moves that we make within that curriculum that move us towards teaching for mastery type of approach. It's also not just really hard questions. For a while, I thought if you've mastered something, then you can do a hard question on it. So that means you can tick that box and say it's mastered. It's much, much more than that. I think mastery in terms of mathematics is a big part about seeing the connections across and through mathematics and not just being able to answer the tough ones. It's also something that you can't just flick a switch and turn on immediately. And I do know that there are schools that have sort of decided from September we'll be doing mastery, and it's always interesting to hear about the planning and the preparation that's gone in before that, because it is a move, it is a journey, I think, toward mastery, and something that you might not see real benefits for 3 to 5 years as you watch pupils move through that system to see the real power of mastery. Now, we know that breaking new learning down into small steps is a good idea. But there's a danger that we think mastery might be breaking sort of learning into micro granules and sort of viewing them in isolation and sort of working hard on them until you can do them without thinking, and then you can tick them off and say that's mastered as well. And obviously that level of sort of fluency and automaticity is something that we would be aspiring to, but we also want to never lose sight of the bigger connections between those granules. And so it's not just about cutting it down into tiny little bits. I suppose the other thing is that it's not all about manipulatives. So I work with complete mathematics, and we talk about CPAL, the concrete pictorial abstract language relationship, that cycle between those four. And I think that when schools and teachers are thinking about shifting toward a mastery approach, then they're probably going to be examining their pedagogy, and that these CPAL approaches are something that they would want to consider, but just wheeling out the base 10 equipment, the questionnaire rods, the coloured counters, isn't mastery again. It's just an element of sort of a powerful pedagogy. And I suppose the other thing that one of my colleagues, Dave Taylor, is fond of saying is that it's not something we just do on a Monday. Mastery is something that we buy into, that we adopt as our philosophy. And so it's not just a case of, okay, we'll do a bit of mastery now at the end of this topic, and we can sort of tick the mastery box. So I suppose that's a big list of things that mastery isn't. And I imagine the rest of the panel will come in at some point and talk about what we feel mastery is. But I think you can come at it from two ends, come at it from a very sort of theoretical high level and talk about a complete philosophy of schooling, about a belief in what learners are capable of doing. And from the other end, you can come at it from quite a technical sense in terms of it's about moves and behaviours that teachers make in the classroom. But I think ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at mastery through the sort of eyes and early work of Benjamin Bloom. His model of mastery is really the only one that's been sort of researched and tested and shown to work over and over, sort of developed further by Thomas Guskey. And it's really just this idea of trying to bring all the benefits of one-to-one tuition. We know that's the best way to work with a student or a pupil, is working one-to-one to bring those benefits into that one-to-many environment which we have in the class, and something that's so hard to do. The famous 2 sigma problem, which Bloom posed, that pupils tutored one-to-one perform on average 2 standard deviations better than the average pupil in a sort of conventional class. So Bloom's early sort of take on mastery was really all about formative assessment and corrective teaching, basically finding out what pupils know and don't know and doing something about it, and taking the time to actually make those changes. And Bloom showed you could get big gains in the classroom doing that. And I think over time, certainly the work that we do at Complete Mathematics is sort of fine-tuned that down even further, really thinking about prerequisite knowledge, really testing if pupils have that, working with corrective teaching and some sort of intervention if required. Some pupils may be doing enrichment work before the whole group moves into a new idea together, where we work through that with a variety of teaching approaches. And then it's all about this continual formative assessment, making sure that we're not moving on until all the pupils have achieved at least that 80% mastery threshold in the new idea. And I think it's huge in mathematics because it is such some people talk about hierarchical subjects, almost more than that. It's so interconnected, mathematics, ideas running all the way up and down through the curriculum and jumping across and joining things together that you wouldn't think were joined together. And a subject that is so interconnected in that way, that being sure of these foundation building blocks is to me, it just seems like a no-brainer, that we would want to go down that approach. So I've obviously hogged the answer to that question, but it's something that I've thought long and hard about. I've seen it working in classes. I think it absolutely is something we should aspire to, but we do need to also understand that it isn't a switch that we can flick. We can't say to teachers, from Monday you have to start doing mastery. It needs a lot of support, it needs a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, and a lot of sort of CPD that goes along with that.
I think Stuart's touched. I'll just add kind of one more thing, and it's something that Stuart touched upon that I want to really reiterate from the reading around mastery that I've done, is that especially thinking from the primary perspective, it's only kind of something that you hear about within mathematics education. There are several kind of schemes out there that, as Stuart mentioned, are offer you some sort of the mastery scheme that's going to cure all your mathematical ills. But actually, it's not the case. I say mathematics is a model of teaching that can apply to pretty much any subject. I'm sure Stuart would challenge that and say it applies to every subject. And I think that's, for me, in terms of my journey as it was, that was the biggest thing, because as I was developing my teaching, my understanding of everything, which was pretty much, before Mark McCourt wrote his book, mastery to me was just something that existed within maths, and there was this special, mastery threshold that you had to get, which is why it was really interesting reading about the historic, beginnings of the mastery as a model of schooling with the, Winnetka plan and things like that. So one thing for sure that it isn't is something that is specific just to maths. It is something that you can apply across, multiple, if not all subjects across a school.
I think it's really interesting what you've talked about, particularly with connections. So Stuart talked about the importance of connections and how interconnected maths is for me. And I think my sort of journey into mastery has come slightly differently, certainly from Stuart's, I think probably from Neil's as well, in that I worked with ARC's Mathematics Mastery Programme, who have a sort of almost a different but connected approach and idea around mastery. So mastery for them ultimately is about being able to approach a concept in an entirely novel way, and having the understanding of that concept to be able to tackle a novel problem involving that concept. I know Stuart said about that not being harder problems, and I agree with that. But I think it is about using that interconnectedness and being able to recognize when we are looking at fractions, say the relationship between multiplication and division. So for me, mastery is something to aspire to, because we as teachers need to make sure that we are thinking about those small steps, we are thinking about the interconnectedness, and we are ensuring that all of the children are, to use my colleague's phrase, on the bus, keeping up with those small steps, in order to be able to then use those and utilize those skills and strategies to different contexts and different problems. So I think, although I come at it from a slightly different perspective, I think actually I have a similar, it's a sort of, they're in the same wheelhouse in terms of the importance of mastery. And I completely agree, it's not something you can just suddenly pick up and do. It's not something, you can't start ARC's Mathematics Mastery scheme and suddenly be doing mastery. It's about a whole school shift, a whole school journey to developing a mastery style of teaching.
I mean, those are pretty comprehensive responses. I think it's difficult, normally I'll push back, but what I don't want to do is I don't want to try and influence the panel's thoughts or look as if I'm pushing one aspect of the panel's responses too much. So I think that's a good way to start. The reason that question's in there is because Elliot Morgan, whenever we're doing live streams, Stuart, before this you were talking about Atol's Maths Chat Live. So he knows that Mark McCourt will listen to Maths Chat Live, and so he will ask us what we think mastery is to try and put us on the spot as much as possible in that situation. So he can consider this question fully answered today. So then the next question came from Tom Oakley on our Discord, which I think most of you, if not all of you guys, are members of to varying degrees. And he says, does extending higher attaining children towards greater depth act in opposition to our efforts to close the gap between pupils? Lisa, you okay if I throw it your way? The air quotes are doing a lot of work in that question, but there are a lot of contentious terms in what is a really provocative question.
It is a provocative question, and I've been thinking about it. And I think what's interesting for me is that my gut reaction is no. My gut reaction is just to say no, Tom, and that's it, end of conversation. Because for me, we close the gap by ensuring that all pupils have access to, if we're thinking about mastery and if we're thinking about fluency, and I'll just define that in a second, I think for me it's about all children having access to mastery style teaching, so that small steps progression, that ensuring everyone is together, the formative assessment, the working out what they don't know, then I think that is what will help close the gap. So for me, fluency, because I know that can be defined in lots of different ways, fluency for me is around being able to, the way I put it is to interrogate a question, so to look at, say, an arithmetic question and really focus on it and think which of the strategies, if it's an addition question, which of my strategies is the best one and is the most efficient one for this particular question. And I think if we are promoting that with all of our learners, then that is what is going to close the gap. So the question talked about our higher attaining pupils and our stretch and challenge. And I think that's, for me, I don't think that is going to I don't think that's going to hinder widening the gap, because I think that those children will be offered depth within a concept. So I think it does again depend on how you're defining stretch and challenge and what you're doing with stretch and challenge. And I know that my colleagues on the panel, you know, will understand the concept of stretch being about depth of a concept rather than bigger numbers or harder questions or whatever it might be. But I also know that we still, in the primary profession in particular, we still have a bit of a hang up there where teachers will think higher retaining pupils need bigger numbers or word problems or multi-step problems or whatever it is. So I don't think that offering depth within a concept to children that are more quickly grasping the basics is going to widen that gap, provided that we are doing all of the formative assessment stuff that Stuart mentioned to make sure that the majority of our students, 80% or whatever sort of target you're setting, are grasping those basics and getting that kind of fluency approach. But I'm happy to be questioned on that.
It's it's a very loaded question. Having talked to Tom Oakley many times, I know how carefully he crafts such things. So, you know, the issue of, you know, greater depth, you know, what is that in mathematics? I don't think anyone really truly actually knows what that is. In fact, I'd go as far as saying it doesn't even exist. You either understand the mathematical ideas and you can apply them in novel contexts, or you can't. The idea that there's kind of something else that's greater depth is, in my opinion, a little bit silly. However, going back to think about what Stuart said there, kind of like the mastery cycle. Part of that mastery cycle is this idea of, you know, enrichment tasks. And so therefore, if you are applying the mastery cycle, you are making that decision that at some point, at some time, there will just be some tasks that only an X percentage of the students will ever see. Now, you could talk about then, like, you know, an equity issue, as whether, you know, is that fair? Because Mary Meyer, I know, talks about how, you know, the children in that who aren't in that kind of greater depth percentile, you know, they crave and they want those kind of activities. And it might be the case that, you know, presenting them those types of activities might actually aid and support their learning. And, you know, you can pair them up and you can do all kinds of, you know, pedagogical choices within the classroom that might actually help support those pupils as well. So it's a very difficult question to answer fully, but I would say that if I had to pick, I would say that it probably does go some way to widening that gap because of the cognitive processes that one must go through with those types of enrichment tasks. Because I'm imagining, whether deliberately or undeliberately, by providing them those tasks, you are bringing about things like method selection. There probably will be an element of interleaving, because you're going to see if they can apply it into a context perhaps that they've learned about previously. There's going to be that added retrieval practice element from those tasks that are only going to help strengthen that mathematical schema. So whilst I understand the reasons why you want to do that, because I say, as mathematics is a pretty, as far as I'm concerned, a pretty hierarchical subject. If you don't understand X, it's difficult for you to go on to the next element of it. But I think then there needs to come that pragmatic, you know, point of view where, you know, when we give children these kind of things, we probably are widening the gap. However, we're doing it for the purpose that actually it's going to either lessen that gap in the future, or it's going to enable those children who aren't ready for that enrichment process to actually keep abreast with everyone else in that group in the kind of the short term.
I'll sort of respond to that before Stuart. Sorry, Stuart. I just wanted to ask Neil. So, do you think then, if I'm understanding you correctly, and I might be totally wrong, do you think then potentially the mastery approach and those kind of options for those enrichment tasks might be widening the gap, but potentially we're shifting the attainment of all the children a little bit higher through that kind of approach. And so while we're widening the gap, the lower attaining children is a bit higher. Does that make sense? I just wondered what you thought there.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. There is a Bloom paper, and I can't recall the exact one, but on it he kind of plots a kind of a standard deviation on the bell curve and what a mastery deviation on the bell curve would be. And, you know, we don't cut out that middle, that kind of bottom 20%. All we do is we shift it a little bit more further on, which, you know, I am a big fan of mastery, of course, but, you know, there's also that element of, you know, being in the classroom and all those decisions that come with it. If we can shift that bell curve, and that's kind of a, you know, that normal distribution, then absolutely, like, that's what we should be doing. And I think, you know, some of these things that, for what I would say is that if it was the same pupils always doing that enrichment, something is probably going wrong. As long as you were ensuring that across, don't want to put it in such blunt terms like a term or whatever, as long as across their mathematical journey, all pupils are kind of experiencing that enrichment, absolutely fine. You know, you are probably doing something right. You know, geometry and number are very different beasts. However, if as you're kind of progressing through this journey of the mathematics, you are finding it's always the same 3, 4, 5 pupils who are accessing that enrichment, I think something's going wrong.
So I'm nodding away here, Neil, with that, particularly with that final point. I think it's so important that we don't lose sight of the fact that all pupils should be getting those opportunities to behave mathematically, to experience, you know, using their maths, as Lisa sort of mentioned earlier on. It's not all about what you know, but what can you do with what you know. And so we must be factoring that into our teaching, that sort of behaving mathematically type phase. But going back to Tom's question, which, you know, I've got a lot of respect for Tom, and I'm delighted that he's given this question. I'd like to think, you know, how are we defining this gap? What is the gap? Is it a gap in attainment? Is it just raw old exam scores at the end of the day? Or are we talking about the gap between pupils' experience of school mathematics? Because some pupils have a really, really tough time going through school, and they don't enjoy maths. They're switched off from an early age. They find it too challenging. They can't make head nor tail of it. And, you know, you've got over a decade of this sort of torment for these poor children. And if there's a gap that we should be closing, the gap that we should close is that one between the experience, because I don't think there's any reason why people should have to find maths so challenging. But there is a sort of source of that, and it tends to be because we quite often give pupils work that's beyond the level that they're actually at. And I think it only gets amplified as we go through the years of schooling, because the gap, which is ultimately going to present itself as an attainment gap, when it comes to GCSE, for example, that gap is also causing groups of pupils to be sort of given work that's deemed to be appropriate for their age, when it's actually not appropriate for their mathematical development. And so, you know, the gap, however we define it, is something we want to tackle. And the way to tackle it is by teaching from mastery. You know, we talked there, or we heard there, about the same 3 or 4 pupils perhaps accessing the enrichment material. It should be the other way around. There should be 3 or 4 pupils getting some corrective instruction for a small amount of time, while the rest of the class do some enrichment, before we then all move on with the new mathematical idea together. Or otherwise our mastery system isn't working. I think if we've only ever got a handful of pupils who are giving sort of extension and enrichment, then there's something not right. There's something broken in that system. And the key really here is to try and remember that greater depth or enrichment, or however we want to call it, it certainly doesn't mean giving bigger numbers. Lisa, absolutely, you're spot on with that. And it also doesn't mean sort of just doing harder versions of the same question. Maths is so rich. I mean, we're probably going to come on and talk about curriculum at some point during this conversation. There's a lot in there already in the school curriculum, but maths is much, much bigger than that. outside of school maths, there's so many interesting things that pupils can be exposed to at various stages in the maths journey, which we can classify as enrichment, and it gives them the opportunity just to see maths in a different light, whether it's simple stuff like working with patterns or looking at combinations, making ordered lists, really being that little bit more mathematical. And so does it close the gap? Does it open the gap? Does it run a risk? If the gap is an attainment gap, then teaching for mastery, which involves giving pupils enrichment material while we support others, in my opinion, is not going to widen that gap, because what we're doing by working with the pupils who need corrective instruction is we're working to close the gap. And that's the point of the whole system. And I don't think that the enrichment material are going to add so much that they're going to open and widen the attainment gap. Yes, there might be something in terms of the richness of the pupil's experience, but I would still rather have large bodies of pupils enjoying the maths journey and being supported and feeling part of the work that the class is doing than have them just be cut adrift and fall by the wayside. 2019, I think, was perhaps the last time we could look at exam results and sort of make some judgment calls. And I've been looking recently at GCSE results. I think grades 7, 8, and 9, so those are the top 3 grades, about 16% of pupils sitting at GCSEs get the 7, 8, or 9. So those are the pupils that are on a pretty good trajectory through school maths. Those are probably the ones in a mastery model where they'll do quite a bit of enrichment, I would imagine. But something like 23% of pupils that sat the GCSE in 2019 got either a U or a 1 or a 2. And that's a huge number who are not achieving in a qualification which I believe they could pass. And they could pass if they'd been on a mastery trajectory from primary school. That's the difference that we can make. And so if it comes to doing a little bit of enrichment work for some pupils whilst we support others, and the support results in them getting a 4 or a 5 for the GCSE at that stage, then we've won a watch, we've done the right thing. And I think that's probably my response to Tom.
Yeah, a deceptively devilish question, that one from Tom. You know, they're not going easy on us at all. Well, I say us. They're not going easy on you guys at all. The next one is from Charlotte Hawthorne, who is obviously, you know, regular at maths comps and big part of them. Johnny Hall's, is it maths takeaways that he does on a Friday night sometimes?
Yeah, teaching together. They do teaching together. Teaching
together, which I think started online, but there's been a few possibly in person. And she says the national curriculum is overcrowded, and some ideas, such as adding fractions and mixed numbers, could easily be left completely until secondary. To what extent do you agree with this statement? And are there other examples that you wish were in Key Stage 1 or 2, but aren't? So another easy one for us to, you know, to the skin of.
Is it overloaded? I would say yes. I think there's a large proportion of the primary teacher population that says, you know, there's far too much content to teach for children to actually be able to master, pardon the pun, the content that we are actually asking them to learn. And I think because of the pressures of an overcrowded curriculum, that's where you have that, that's where that conveyor belt curriculum approach then starts to come in. You think, oh, God, I have to take children through this journey quickly because I have this end result here, which is that either Key Stage 1 SATs at Year 2 or Key Stage 2 SATs, Key Stage 1 SATs at Year 2 or Key Stage 2 SATs at Year 6. Saying that though, I don't think adding mixed numbers is one of those things that I would take out. I think if you're pretty content with the idea of addition and you really have a thorough understanding of what addition is, and you really understand your times tables, the adding of mixed numbers is not something that should particularly give you much discomfort. That said, I think there are things that we can do with the primary curriculum to ensure that pupils have enough time, particularly at Key Stage 1, to really understand those foundations of mathematics, because I think that's where you have to be very careful. So much mathematics happens early on in the early years, Key Stage 1. And I think if you track people's understanding of particularly number back far enough, I think you'll find that where they fall down is probably around Key Stage 1, because of that kind of conveyor belt we need to kind of get through. Things like we expect, because of the national curriculum, whilst students are still trying to understand and come together with the base 10 system, we then throw base 60 at them quite quickly through the act of telling time and how many hours are minutes and how many hours are days, etc., etc. And I think at that point, it potentially is too abstract for them. So time, if I could wield a magic wand and say what can be taken out of Key Stage 1 to provide more time to make sure the foundation of the success can be there, I would take time out completely. Many a teacher argues about the idea of Roman numerals being taken out. I'm actually a big fan of the Roman numerals, just because for so many, for some pupils who I've taught who have struggled with the idea of a place value system, once you throw an additive system at them like Roman numerals, a lot of place value seems to click in place. And I think for that reason, which again is totally part of my own experience of teaching mathematics, it's been the thing that children need to kind of click. So I know that some teachers, when they hear this question, might say, yeah, throw out Roman numerals. I would keep it in for that reason. But I think our biggest wins are definitely getting rid of time from Key Stage 1 completely. I would take fractions out of year 1 and move all of that content perhaps to year 2, year 3 as well, because I think fractions, again, this idea of pupils, in my experience, they're still not kind of clear the fact, the way that you can partition 7 and the sevenness of 7, and 7 can be 1 and 6, it can be 2 and 5. The idea that then we kind of have this half of what a 1 is as well, it kind of happens too early in that kind of mathematical trajectory for my experience anyway. I'll pass it on to Lisa now, because you could rant about this all day and I don't want it to be that.
Thanks, Neil. I agree with you in a lot of those points. I think fractions and adding fractions, I've been almost circular with my thinking around this. So I have been, so this year and last year, I've been writing a curriculum for the trust. So I've been writing a whole scheme of work, as it were. It's not quite that, but it's I've been writing a curriculum for years 1 to year 6 for the trust, thinking about all of these things. And at one point I wanted to get rid of things like adding and subtracting fractions, particularly when it came to mixed numbers, or particularly when it came to where there was a lot of equivalence to find, because I felt that it was a lot cognitively for children to grasp. But then I actually came round to thinking again, because if we want our pupils to be fluent with additive structures and like as Neil said, really understanding what addition is, and the different strategies that we can use for addition and subtraction, then I think that actually it's a really important part of that, and I think it's really important for development. I would get rid of time in Key Stage 1. If I had my way, there would be no formal teaching of time until probably year 5 or year 6. I'm not saying you'd never look at the time, but I think the formal expectations for time, children, as you say, the base 60 system is complicated. Children these days, particularly when we're thinking about analog time, their lived experiences of that just aren't really what we even as children had. I mean, I remember having a watch as a child that was an analog watch, and children now don't experience that. So I would personally get rid of it all until year 5 or year 6, and kind of teach it incidentally. My thing at the moment that I'm grappling with, and I'm sure Neil and Stuart will have opinions on, is around statistics across the national curriculum, specifically line graphs. So I've actually stripped out line graphs from most of Key Stage 2, and they're being taught in science. But I'm thinking more now about how graphs are used and how kind of line equations and things like that are used in secondary. So this year I've run the NCTM's 5 to 8 continuity programme, and it's made me really think about how graphs, line graphs in particular, are used in secondary, thinking about two variables, whereas we in primary, it's almost always a time and something graph, so time distance graph. And I think that we are not exposing children enough to the way I call it, and it's not a very mathematical thing, but the connection between coordinates and graphs. We teach them very separately in primary, and I think we need to think more carefully about how they come together. So I would like to, rather than throw it all out, I'd like to have a rethink about how we look at graphical representations in primary, thinking about how they can work in other subjects like science, and how necessarily, you know, how we can teach them differently to support the sort of linear journey into secondary. So
now I'm nodding away with what Lisa said there. I think a lot of really helpful points coming out there. It's perhaps appropriate just now. This might be the moment for me to reveal the horrifying truth that my background is in secondary teaching. 15 years in the classroom, head of secondary maths. But since joining Complete Maths, I've had the delight and the pleasure and the privilege of meeting, working with, and talking to lots of primary teachers. Listening to this podcast has been great for me, a revelation for me. Listening to folks like yourselves speaking has really widened my eyes to what goes on in primary schools. And I don't just mean in mathematics, because of course we've got to remember that primary teachers wear many hats, and to be able to teach somebody to read and write, and yet to still also be able to build the solid mathematical foundations, I think that deserves incredible kudos and recognition. It really is amazing what primary teachers do. And so I suppose I'm sort of kind of uniquely placed on the panel to comment on this. Not also least because most of my teaching career has been in Scotland, where the curriculum is obviously different. But there's a few things that I wanted to say on this question, which I'm not a fan of this question, in the sense that I don't think it's helpful to split primary and secondary in the way that we do. I'm not even convinced the sort of key stages are really helpful either, because they're all nudging towards at this age you should be doing this sort of thing. Now, if you're on the trajectory to get the grades 7, 8 and 9 for GCSE, and you're in that 16%, and that's great. But there's over 80% who are probably not quite ready to be doing what we're giving to them. And so I like to just try and think about the curriculum as a whole big experience, and just a sort of an all through thing. One of the things that's come up in many conversations with different groups of primary teachers is this thing about time. It's really quite incredible. As a secondary teacher, 10, 12 years into my career, I would have no idea how to teach somebody time at all. So I can imagine there are huge challenges in there. So Neil's idea of taking time to make time, I think I quite like that. There's probably a t-shirt in there, Neil, somewhere. But what I would rather we talked about, or rather we considered, was instead of either pulling content out or pushing content off into the secondary world, is that we focus on our pedagogy and we think about how we can perhaps improve the quality of the learning that goes on, because we might find that those pupils who struggle to add fractions in year 6, say, who then go to secondary school and struggle to add fractions in year 7, and then we find we're still trying to teach them to add fractions in year 10, maybe it would make more sense to really focus on what goes on at the beginning there. We don't need to have big numbers. We don't necessarily have to have mixed numbers, but the concept of fractionness, the understanding of addition, and then working with things like common denominators and that idea of sort of unitization and things that are so powerful because they appear over and over and over as we carry on through this journey in the sort of wonderful universe of maths. So instead of talking about what are we going to sort of horse trade across the fictitious boundary of primary and secondary, I think we should really be saying, what can we learn from one another about how we teach these things? And as a secondary teacher, I can tell you what pupils really struggle with for years into secondary maths, and then maybe we can reflect back and say, well, what's the experience in primary like, and how can we together come up with a way of tackling this and solving this? Now, you talked, Lisa, about statistics, and my predecessor as head of department at the school where I then became head of departments was a massive statistician, big fan of statistics. And I basically spent the next 6 years trying to eke statistics out of our curriculum, just slowly moving it away, because I believe in the era that we live in now, statistical literacy is massively important. But we're looking at big data, and we're looking at algorithms, and we're looking at it's all done through technology. So what's most important for me, and some of my colleagues might not be happy with this, is not that we spend hours and hours painstakingly drawing bar charts and line graphs and things. It's that we start to get an idea of what these graphs show us, what these graphs tell us, what can we understand to be true, what can we question and challenge about these things. And if you can sort of farm off the line graphs to science, then I think that's a great idea. But do we really want pupils to be painstakingly marking out the intervals on axes and sort of plotting points? Yeah, it's all good for the the manual dexterity and the hand-eye coordination, and there's value in all of these sort of practical things. But for me, I think I would rather be showing pupils a couple of graphs and saying, what are these telling us? How can we challenge these? So we can still have statistics in the curriculum, but just take a different sort of slant or a different sort of view on what we're trying to achieve with it. And then your talk about graphs took you on a little bit, Lisa, to talk about this link you said, I think, between coordinates and graphs, this coordinates and graphs thing. And I think I'm right in the way that I'm interpreting what you're saying, in that you're talking about sort of the relationship between what we kind of put in and what kind of comes out. So we do this and we get that back, which is essentially a function, a mathematical function, a rule that takes an input, processes it in some way, turns it into an output. And you've hit the nail on the head. This was the bit I was really nodding at, Lisa, to be honest, because I know for a fact that the pupils I've taught, and it could well be just through my sheer incompetence in teaching, but the pupils I've taught have really, really struggled to get the connection between a function, which is like a mathematical rule written algebraically, and the graph that it produces. This idea of we feed something in, we process it, it comes out, and you know what? Not only does it have a nice numerical pattern, we can see a constant pattern or some sort of pattern in the numbers, it's got a beautiful graph that is the visualization of the pattern that the function created. And I think far too many pupils, unfortunately, despite teachers' best efforts, it seems, don't see that connection and appreciate that beauty. And this goes back to what we were talking about in the first point, once you realize that you put something in, you process it, something comes out, and if you know what comes out and you kind of know what went in, then you can figure out the rule that created it, and you can run it in reverse, and you can put two of them together and you can make new things. It opens up, it unlocks the door to so much of secondary maths. So I'm 100% with you, Lisa, in your curriculum. Coordinates and graphs, functions, that's where we want to go. Rules, if there's a this is what I often say, you can see it visually with just pictures. If there's a visual pattern or a numerical pattern, then there's a rule, and if there's a rule, there's a graph. And once we've got the graph, we've got power. We can do all sorts of wonderful stuff. So sort of beating around the bush a little bit of this question, but that I think is something that we could definitely explore and take advantage of.
Thanks, Stuart, because function was the word I was looking for, and that's with my lack of secondary. So I think, yeah, I agree completely. I think that's the thing. I think what you said about, us, there needs to be more collaboration between primary and secondary. And I think, unfortunately, schools, we are tied to the national curriculum, unfortunately. But we do have a bit of flexibility there. And I do think we need to be thinking a bit more carefully about actually, well, okay, if we've got an end of key stage 2 deadline because of SATs, unfortunately, but I know they don't. I'm with you. I think it's a linear process. What can we do? How can we jiggle things around? And I think you're exactly right with the for us primary people, children think of graphs and they think of line graphs and interpreting line graphs, and the interpretation is what was happening at 7 o'clock, at what time was the I don't know, the bath at 50, whatever it is, and they don't think about it in the way of functions and rules and patterns. And I think that's where we're missing out. I think we have elements of the primary curriculum that, rather than throwing out or rather than moving, although I think something should be moved later, like time. I think it is about looking at secondary and thinking, well, okay, what can we do to support where their learning is going? And then also, like you say, what are you struggling with in secondary that we can then make sure that we are building those foundations of, which circles nicely back to mastery.
It does all tie together, because I think I'm trying to give as few opinions as possible. My only note from the actual panel was be more neutral when hosting. That was my takeaway from the weekend. But where the attitude that you've adopted and developed over time, Stuart, where you acknowledge that this is one big journey and that there's a camaraderie between primary and secondary that's necessary for success. It feeds into what you're saying, Lisa, about the primary expectations. Well, those expectations are exactly the same for foundation, give or take a few bits of material, when the pupils are maybe 6 years older, when they're sitting their GCSEs. And so where you don't take this sort of well-rounded and carefully considered approach, that's where you end up with pupils still failing to meet that basic threshold of functional numeracy, which essentially a foundation GCSE means you can go out into the world and it won't be a massive struggle for you. Anything above that, and then you're becoming more and more proficient. So I think it's really important that the more we can do to support each other across phases and to adopt your position, Stuart, I think the better off the system will be. Just
to sort of round it up a little bit in terms of supporting one another, talking across the sectors. Complete Maths does a whole bunch of maths confs, which you may be familiar with. I know you've been involved in them. The panel's been involved in them. We're running a primary maths conf. We've done it in the past. We're doing another one, which is very, very exciting. I'm looking forward to being there, and I hope as many of you will be there as possible. 28th of September is the date in Leicester. So have a look at the completemaths.com website and find out more about that. I think a great opportunity, one-day conference for colleagues to get together, and not just primary. I've been saying to as many secondary colleagues as I can, listen to this podcast. You'll learn, you might learn more about maths teaching in one episode than you have in the last 5 years of your sort of secondary world. It really is that important.
That's obviously very kind of you to say, Stuart. I mean, my first interaction with MathsConf, despite seeing it from afar for a number of years, I was worried about the fact that there were secondary teachers there. As irrational as that is, I thought secondary teachers, as a primary teacher, I'm inferior to them because I don't have the subject knowledge. I don't have the specialism to that extent. And then I went to the first virtual conf, and just watched, and we were having, there were chats happening on YouTube, and I thought, well, actually, this isn't as scary as I thought it was going to be. And if I have a message for anybody who's thinking about going to MathsConf, so for instance, MathsConf 30 is in Manchester, although there is a virtual one in August before then, it's go for it, because I'm trying to get as many primary people to join me as possible so I can hear lots more about maths, but also it's a completely irrational fear, because teachers just want to help each other. Teachers just want everybody else to do a really good job. So any concerns were in my head, and they might just be in yours too.
Can I just echo what you said, Kieran? So my first MathsConf experience was a face-to-face one several years ago in Kettering, not to be confused with the Kettering one you've just done. And I went on my own, and it was, I think there has, I mean, I might be wrong, but I think there's been more of a primary presence more recently than perhaps when I went. I met very few primary people there, but that wasn't because I mean, I spoke to lots of people, but I may have just spoken to, I was random sample, they were all secondary people, but they were so supportive and they were so interested in what we do at primary. And I think, working with this 5 to 8 continuity program has made me realize just how in awe I am of secondary teachers, but equally how in awe of primary teachers, secondary teachers are, because I think, as Stuart has said, they don't necessarily grasp how we teach time. They have no real concept of how we teach early number to children, and they are blown away. So I echo that, Kieran. If you're thinking about coming to MathsConf, do, because we'll be there when we can get around the country, and you'll meet some amazing people and you will learn so much as well.
Yeah, no, my first I was fortunate that I had a few of the MathsConf Mini, the online ones, and obviously very fortunate, Kieran, that you decided that you'd take a chance and present on me about some of the ideas we've talked about and challenge and depth and what all that means. Kettering was my first one in person, and I was apprehensive, especially for those of you who don't know, they always enjoy a treasure hunt, which is full of mathematical challenges, which is, full disclosure, goes far beyond my understanding of mathematics. However, the conversations that I was able to have with people about, we understand, mathematics is a hierarchical subject. There are things that primary teachers can do that secondary teachers do need to know, because there is this 7, 8, 9, 10, age gap between what your highest attaining child in year 7 can compared to your lowest attaining. And the fact of the matter is that child who's at that lower end of that attainment gap needs the pedagogy that primary school teachers, are able to access. At the panel, I mentioned about how, understanding the principles of counting. If you have children there who aren't able to actually count yet, understanding what those 5 principles of counting are so important before you can actually then progress them on that journey. And you'll be amazed, and how much your pedagogy actually changes once you can verbalize, once you actually understand what those counting principles are. That, it is one of those, in terms of those, like the mathematical didactics that complete maths offer, and that Mark McCourt talks about a lot. Understanding those is, it just opens up a world of mathematics to students, because you're able to teach it to them in a way that hopefully then makes sense to them. So yeah, lots of love for the MathsCons, and you get really cool mugs. So what's not to enjoy about that?
Yeah, splitting the sessions is a really good idea, because Chris Such and Matt Swain did it at that virtual one, and me and Neil did it at a later one. It splits the workload, but also takes half the pressure onto the other person as well. So this has been fantastic. I might try and get you guys together once a week, because even though we did these questions before, the answers aren't exactly the same. There are themes, but the examples are different, and I could literally listen to you guys talk for hours about this stuff. And I say that quite a lot, but actually I've done all the listening tonight, and I could do a whole lot more. But I do think that we've got time for one more question, and I think it sums up everything quite nicely. And I'd like to know, what gives you hope for the future of mathematics education?
Well, I'll go first, I suppose. We all must have hope for the future of maths education, or we wouldn't be sitting here on this panel. We wouldn't be tuning in to this podcast. We must have hope, and I think that's what it is. It's the community, and it's the people that are involved in the community, because especially over the last couple of years with all the different challenges, and education is not the only sector that's been stretched, but teachers have done incredible things, amazing things. Learn Zoom, for instance, become wizards on technology that they might never actually have touched, and all to support the children that they care about. And so I know this question is about maths education, but that first part of that answer, without a doubt, is just about education in general. We need great people in teaching. You're not going to become a millionaire at the end of it, but there's a different reward there for you. And I'm not in the classroom anymore, so I don't get to work with young people on a daily basis. But I still think that I'm contributing in some way, trying to help and encourage teachers to look at their pedagogy and make some changes that will impact on to children. So I think that's my big hope for education. In terms of mathematics, I think we really do have a small but growing nucleus of people who do now understand a mastery type model and a way of being highly effective when it comes to teaching mathematics. And the more that we talk across the whole of schooling, primary and secondary, the more we work together, the more we share that understanding, and the more people that join and take an approach that is putting the pupils at the centre rather than sort of putting grades and, sort of, I'm reluctant to say sort of government driven, but certainly political agendas ahead of pupils' experience of schooling. The more that we sort of start to think in that way, I think the better for everybody. The better the experience is for the pupils, but also the more enjoyable it is for teachers as we work through. What gives me hope? It gives me hope that we are going in the right direction. Some of you, I think, on the panel have contributed to the latest effort that we've made at Complete Maths to try and help teachers close these gaps and to do the corrective work. The tutor platform that we have is something that is knocking on the door. Well, in fact, it's probably going through the door now of solving Benjamin Bloom's 2 Sigma problem. We do have a situation where you could give every pupil in your class a one-to-one tutor if you wanted to. And so with people in the sector thinking like that, producing resources like that, that's the sort of thing that gives me hope for the future of maths education.
What gives me hope is quite nicely introduced by Stuart, but I think I'm going to be a bit more primary specific. So when I started my teaching career 13 years ago now, doesn't feel like, feels like yesterday, but I was given the role of maths lead as an NQT. I've got an English degree, so I often feel like I'm cheating a little bit when I talk about maths, but I was given the role of maths lead and had no idea what I was doing. And back then, in my little corner of the world, so Norfolk, generally attainment is not great in Norfolk. It's getting better, it has highs and lows, but the CPD was not great either, so there weren't many opportunities for primary professional development. Certainly back then mastery wasn't a word anyone talked about. People started talking about manipulatives, and the only person really who gave me professional development was a woman called Alison Borthwick, who was just incredible. I think she's quite well known across the UK, but she's a really good early maths specialist working in Norfolk and Suffolk, and she's just incredible. But if you fast forward to now, primary is actually being recognised, and I think secondary schools, I think maths and trusts are actually giving a damn about what is happening in primary in terms of mathematics education. I'm not saying that nobody did 12, 13 years ago, but certainly if I think now about the opportunities that teachers have to develop their understanding, we have the NCETM, we have Complete Maths, we have various schemes, and as we've said, there are issues with those schemes, but at least they are trying to address problems that we have in teaching of maths. And I think that you've got hubs and you've got local authorities doing more and more specifically for primary education. We have this wonderful, very exciting primary maths conference coming up. You don't see many primary dedicated maths things, but there are more and more, and that's what gives me hope for the primary mathematics teaching. It gives me hope because we are on the map now. You can't ignore us. You can't ignore the fact, and the fact that we've got specialists. I'm really lucky that I'm a specialist in inverting, going quote marks, but I get to lead maths across my trust. And I know, the work Neil and Kieran do amongst so many other people. We are a small but mighty collection of primary specialist people, and that gives me hope. That makes me really excited for the future.
Yeah, just to echo what everyone said, I just think the wealth of information that is out there for primary school teachers to learn more, and not just about subject knowledge in terms of how do I extend, think about what Key Stage 3 maths looks like, but just the pedagogical content knowledge that is out there for primary school teachers, whether that be through full disclosure, our trust, where every teacher has a log on to Complete Maths CPD College, which we find invaluable. It's not the only one out there, of course not, but that has fundamentally changed the way that I know some of our teachers have thought about the way that they teach or present certain mathematical ideas. So I think what gives me hope is that there seems to be, with the advent of kind of curriculum that comes in the last kind of 5 odd years, what's come with that, and I think it's changed a little bit behind it, is this pedagogical content knowledge that people are now starting to understand. Oh, right, okay, well, we have this really interesting curriculum. Now it's like, how do we enact this so actually children actually begin to learn this? And I think that's what kind of gives me hope, is that we're kind of starting to drift into that next phase of development that I think most schools are probably coming to now, which is that how do we enact this in a way that means that all children can understand it? Where do I go to? That means that if I've used Numicon to try and teach number bonds within 10, where do I go to now if Numicon hasn't worked for that child? Well, okay, Kieran's done some CPD Maths College on how to use Cuisenaire rods, for example, on how to do that. Okay, brilliant. I got a set of those in the maths cupboard. I'll try and use those, or double-sided counters, whatever it might be. And I just think having that wealth of information at your fingertips is just going to be so valuable to teachers.
Lots of reasons to be hopeful then. And, you know, I'm totally with you, Neil. I mean, I think I've subscribed the last 3 years, you know, even before I was on there, I was watching those videos while, you know, in the background and stuff. And I think it's, you know, we don't recommend stuff unless we genuinely mean what we say. And it's been a part of my professional development for years. And it's, you know, my school pay for it, and it's ridiculously cheap, you know, 82 quid, 84 quid, I think, which is nothing in a school budget. But for the value, you know, you can watch Johnny Hall talking about multi-base, you know, for 60 minutes, but spread out over maybe 5 or 6 activities. You know, Atol's made it last 3 months on the Discord. I know, and I know so much more about place value now because of Atol taking in different directions.
You've done really well, Kieran, to sort of be impartial and remain quiet at the side. But there's definitely scope here for you to take that last question yourself as well, and tell us what gives you hope about the future of maths education.
No, I ask the questions around here. I mean, we've had 3 tremendously challenging years, and teachers, schools and their pupils, you know, the communities are still going strong. You know, basically, if you'd said to people in 2019 that there would be a worldwide pandemic that would bring everything to a halt, but that you would need to summon the strength to keep going, even wave after wave of difficulty, you know, I would have laughed and said, no, it's impossible. We'll just give up as a species. But, you know, I hope I'm not being too hyperbolic, but we didn't. And we're almost back to that point now where the losses that did take place in many instances, you know, where people are taking a sensible approach to how they want to support people's in I don't want to use the term catching up, but I suppose I have to, you know, in filling those gaps or in learning the mathematics that they missed out on because the conditions weren't ideal. You know, I feel hopeful that it might be possible to get back to where we were and maybe even go further than that. So I don't know if that's a bit of a soppy and deluded answer, but yeah, I think the resilience shown by the profession and our commitment to our pupils, you know, I think that's what drives most people, and I think that's what will drive us forward in the future. I mean, it's been wonderful chatting to you guys. All that's left to do is to say thank you very much to Tom and Charlotte for their questions that they provided. Thank you to everyone who sponsors Ko-fi, who listens every week. Thank you, Lisa.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure to spend my evening talking about maths, particularly with such wonderful, interesting people with great opinions. Thanks.
Thank you, Stuart.
Well, thank you, Kieran, for inviting me onto the panel, and thank you, Lisa and Neil. You know, just to echo what Lisa said, great conversation tonight, and I'm looking forward to next week.
And thank you, Neil.
Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to MathsConf Primary in September. I'll definitely be there.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.